The sun was setting over the prairie when Margaret heard the knock at her door, and she wasn't expecting anyone at this hour because most folks in these parts knew better than to come calling after supper time. But there it was again, and more urgent this time, so she set down her sewing and walked to the door, with that cautious feeling you get when something unexpected breaks the quiet rhythm of your evening. Through the screen she could see a man standing there, and his hat was pulled low, and his shoulders were bent like he was carrying the weight of the world. And even in the dim light of the porch, she could see the dust on his boots, and the weariness in the way he stood. And when he looked up at her, his eyes had that desperate look she'd seen before in people who'd come to the end of their rope, ma'am, he said. And his voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. And I hate to trouble you, but my baby needs milk. And I've been to 3 places already and nobody has any to spare, and I know it's asking a lot from a stranger, but I'm begging you. And if you have even a little bit, I can pay you whatever you need. Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face stirred a memory she couldn't quite place, and it was like seeing someone in a dream where you know them, but you can't remember from where. And she pushed that feeling aside because there was a baby that needed feeding, and that was what mattered right now. Come inside, she said, and pushed open the screen door, and the man hesitated like he wasn't sure he'd heard right, and she gestured more firmly and said, I've got fresh milk from this morning, and you can have what you need and bring the baby in where it's warm. The man's face did something then, and it was like watching ice crack in the spring, and he turned and hurried to his truck. And when he came back, he was carrying a bundle wrapped in a faded blue blanket. And Margaret could see the tiny face peeking out, and those small features that babies have that make you want to protect them from everything hard in this world. She led them to the kitchen, and the familiar comfort of that room with its worn table, and the smell of the bread she'd baked that morning, and she poured milk into a clean bottle and warmed it the way she'd done 1,000 times before when her own children were small. And those days felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago here, she said, and handed the bottle to the man, and his hands were shaking as he took it and began feeding the baby, and Margaret watched the infant's small mouth working eagerly, and the desperate little sounds of hunger being satisfied, and it reminded her of how simple and profound those basic needs are, and how we forget that sometimes when life gets complicated. The man sat at her table and fed his child, and Margaret busied herself making coffee because that's what you do when someone comes to your home, even if they're a stranger, and especially if they're carrying trouble. And after a few minutes, the baby's eyes started to close in that sweet milk-drunk expression that babies get when they're finally full and content. Thank you, he said, and his voice broke a little, and I don't know what I would have done if you'd turned me away, and most people did, and I understand why, because times are hard and folks have to look after their own. But you didn't, and I won't forget that. Margaret poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him, and she noticed his hands properly now, and they were work-roughened hands with scars across the knuckles, and she knew those were the hands of a man who'd done hard labor all his life, and probably never complained about it much. What's your name? She asked, and sat down across from him. And the baby was sleeping now in the crook of his arm and looking peaceful in that way that makes you believe the world might be okay. After all, James, he said, and James Sullivan, and this here is my daughter, Emma. And her mother passed 3 weeks ago, and I've been trying to manage on my own, but I don't know much about babies, and I've been learning as I go. And today I ran out of formula, and the store in town won't extend me any more credit until I can pay what I owe. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. And it was that old familiar ache of recognizing pain in another person, and she'd lost her own husband 5 years back, and she knew what it was like to suddenly be alone with responsibilities that felt too heavy to carry, and she looked at this man holding his motherless baby, and she saw herself reflected back. Sullivan, she said slowly, and are you kin to the Sullivans who used to ranch over by Cedar Creek and back before the drought hit and before so many families had to sell and move on? James looked up at her sharply, and his eyes were suddenly alert in a way they hadn't been before, and he said, that was my father's place, and we lost it when I was 17 and had to move east and find work where we could, and I haven't been back to this county in over 30 years, and how do you know about that? Margaret stood and walked to the window and looked out at the darkening prairie, and the memories were coming back now, clear as spring water, and she remembered a summer when she was 15, and there was a boy who worked on her father's ranch for a season, and he'd been quiet and serious and good with the horses, and she'd thought he was the most interesting person she'd ever met. I knew a James Sullivan once, she said, and her voice was soft with remembering. And he worked for my father one summer, and we used to talk by the barn after the work was done. And he told me he wanted to save enough money to keep his family's ranch, and he had all these dreams about the future, and then one day he was just gone, and I never knew why. The silence in the kitchen was so complete. You could hear the old clock ticking on the wall, and James was staring at her now, and his face had gone pale under the prairie tan, and he said, "Margaret, and is that you and Margaret Hayes?" And his voice trailed off like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "It's Margaret Cooper now," she said, and turned to face him. "And I married Robert Cooper the year after you left, and we had this farm together until he passed," and she could see him working through the mathematics of time and trying to reconcile the girl he'd known with the woman standing before him. "I left without saying goodbye," he said, and his voice was thick with old regret. "And my father got sick and we had to leave fast, and I wanted to write, but I didn't know what to say, and I was just a kid who didn't have anything to offer you, and I thought you'd forget about me soon enough and move on with your life." Margaret sat back down and wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, and she said, "I did move on, and I had a good life with Robert and 3 fine children who are grown now with families of their own, but I never quite forgot that summer, or the boy who listened when I talked about wanting to see the ocean someday, and who told me I could do anything I set my mind to." They sat there in the gentle light of the kitchen, and the years seemed to fold in on themselves until past and present were sitting at the same table, and Emma stirred in her father's arms and made a small sound, and then settled back into sleep. And Margaret thought about how strange life was, and how it could bring people back together in the most unexpected ways. "You can't manage a baby alone," she said, "and especially not while you're trying to work. And I have space here and plenty of milk from my cows. And if you need a place to stay until you get on your feet, then you're welcome to the cottage out back, and it's small, but it's clean and warm." James looked at her like she'd offered him the world, and he said, "I can't accept charity, and I'll work for it, and I'm good with my hands, and I can see your barn needs some repairs, and there's fencing that wants mending, and I'll earn our keep." Margaret smiled and said, "This isn't charity, James, and this is neighbors helping neighbors, and that's how we survive out here, and besides, and I could use the help, and it's been hard managing everything alone." And so it was settled in that simple way that important things sometimes are, and James moved into the cottage with Emma, and in the days that followed, he worked on Margaret's property and fixed all the things that had been slowly falling into disrepair and the way things do when there's no one to tend to them. And Margaret found herself looking forward to the sound of his hammer in the morning and the sight of him walking up to the house for coffee. She taught him how to care for Emma properly and showed him the rhythms of feeding and sleeping and all those small attentions that babies need. And he was a quick learner and gentle with his daughter in a way that made Margaret's heart ache because she could see how much he loved this child and how terrified he was of failing her. They fell into an easy routine, and James would work during the day while Margaret minded Emma, and in the evenings they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset and talk the way they had when they were young, and except now they had lives full of experience behind them, and losses that had shaped them, and wisdom earned through hardship. One evening about 2 months after he'd arrived, James said, "To her, you know, I spent 30 years thinking I'd made the right choice leaving the way I did, and convincing myself it was better for everyone, but seeing you again and being here, and I realize I was just scared, and scared of not being good enough, and of letting people down." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We all make choices based on what we know at the time. And you were 17, James, and trying to help your family, and that took courage, and you can't spend your whole life wondering about the roads you didn't take. But what if some roads circle back around," he said, "and what if we get a second chance at things we thought were lost forever?" Margaret looked at him, and in the fading light she could